The weight of the crown pressed against my temples as Archbishop Whitmore lifted it high above my head, his voice echoing through the vast stone halls of Westminster Abbey. I am Theodore Blackwood, 28 years of age, and in this moment, I was about to become King of England. The autumn mist hung thick outside the stained glass windows, casting ethereal shadows across the faces of hundreds of nobles, clergy, and servants who had gathered to witness my coronation on this cold November morning in 1673. By the grace of Almighty God, the Archbishop intoned, his aged hands trembling slightly as he lowered the ancient crown of St. Edward onto my head, I crown thee Theodore, King of England, defender of the faith, sovereign of these realms. The weight was more than physical, it carried the hopes, fears, and expectations of an entire kingdom. My father had died suddenly 3 months prior, leaving me to ascend a throne I had prepared for my entire life, yet somehow still felt unprepared to occupy. As the crown settled upon my brow, I felt the collective breath of the assembly being held in reverence. The cold November air seemed to seep through the very stones of the abbey, and I could hear the distant sound of rain beginning to patter against the windows. My dark hair, carefully groomed for this ceremony, felt heavy beneath the golden circlet, and my brown eyes surveyed the sea of faces before me, lords and ladies in their finest velvets and silks, their expressions ranging from genuine loyalty to calculated political interest. But then, as my gaze swept across the assembly, it stopped. There, among the servants standing in the shadows near the great pillars, I saw a face that made my heart skip a beat. Auburn hair, partially concealed beneath a simple white cap, framed features I had never forgotten, gentle green eyes, a face marked by both kindness and determination, hands that I knew bore the small scars of someone who had spent years gathering herbs and tending to the sick. Isabel Hartwell. She was here, in my castle, dressed as a maid. The ceremony continued around me, but suddenly I felt as though I were watching it from outside my own body. 3 years. It had been 3 years since I had last seen her, and the recognition hit me like a physical blow. She stood there quietly, respectfully, among the other castle servants, her eyes properly downcast as protocol demanded during a royal ceremony. She had no idea, I realized with growing certainty, that the prince she had once helped save his mother's life now sat before her as king. The Archbishop was speaking again, something about duty and divine right, but my mind was racing backward through time. I remembered the desperate autumn of 1670, when my mother, Queen Catherine, lay dying in her chambers while the finest physicians in England declared themselves helpless against her mysterious fever. I remembered how I had defied protocol, disguised myself in common clothes, and ventured into the countryside seeking any healer, any hope that the medical establishment could not provide. The irony was not lost on me that here I sat, newly crowned, thinking not of the weight of kingship but of a village healer's apprentice who had worked miracles with nothing more than herbs, dedication, and an understanding of medicine that surpassed men with decades more training and infinitely more social standing. The woman who had saved the Queen of England now cleaned floors and lit fires in the very castle where she should have been honored as a hero. Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom according to their respective laws and customs? The Archbishop's question pulled me back to the present moment. I solemnly promise so to do, I replied, my voice carrying across the abbey with more conviction than I felt. Even as I spoke the ancient words of the coronation oath, part of my mind was calculating. How long had Isabel been working in the castle? How had she come to be here? Did anyone else know of her role in saving my mother's life? The ceremony continued with its ancient rhythms, the anointing with holy oil, the presentation of the regalia, the placing of the ring upon my finger. Each ritual was performed with the solemnity that centuries of tradition demanded, yet I found myself stealing glances toward that corner where Isabel stood. She had grown more beautiful in the years since I had seen her, though there was a weariness in her posture that spoke of hard work and difficult circumstances. Her hands, clasped before her, bore the same small scars I remembered, evidence of her continued dedication to healing, even in her reduced circumstances. As the final prayers were offered and the assembly began to sing the Te Deum, I made a decision that would change everything. I would find a way to speak with her, to discover how she had come to be here, and perhaps, though I hardly dared hope, to finally express the gratitude that had burned in my heart for 3 long years. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. I was now King of England, with all the duties and restrictions that entailed. The court would expect me to marry advantageously, to form alliances through matrimony, to choose a bride who would strengthen England's position among the European powers. The very idea of a king showing interest in a servant, no matter how deserving, was scandalous beyond measure. But as the ceremony drew to its close and I prepared to process out of the abbey as the newly crowned sovereign, I knew I could not simply pretend I had not seen her. Isabel Hartwell had saved my mother's life when no one else could. She had worked through stormy nights, mixing herbs and broths, sitting vigil beside the Queen's bedside with a dedication that put the court physicians to shame. She had asked for nothing in return, had sworn to keep the secret of her involvement when political necessity demanded it, and had disappeared back into her humble life without complaint. Now fate had brought her back into my life, and I was determined not to waste this opportunity. Somehow, despite the impossible gulf between our stations, despite the scandal it would cause, despite everything that protocol and prudence dictated, I would find a way to speak with her again. The procession began to move, and I walked slowly down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, the crown heavy upon my head, the ceremonial robes trailing behind me. The assembled nobility bowed deeply as I passed, their faces respectful but unreadable. As I drew near to the section where the servants stood, I allowed my gaze to find Isabel once more. She was looking down, as was proper, but something, perhaps some instinct, made her glance up just as I passed. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and I saw recognition flicker across her features before she quickly looked away again. My heart pounded against my ribs. She did remember me, despite the crown and the ceremonial garb. The question was whether she understood that the young man she had helped save his mother 3 years ago was now the King of England. As I continued toward the great doors of the Abbey, already planning how I might arrange to encounter her again, I couldn't have known that this moment of recognition would set in motion events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about duty, love, and the true meaning of nobility. The memories came flooding back as I made my way through the great hall, acknowledging the bows and curtsies of my subjects with practiced grace while my mind traveled back to that terrible autumn of 1670. My mother had fallen ill in early October, just as the leaves were beginning to turn and the first cold rains of the season had begun to lash the castle walls. What had started as a simple cough had quickly developed into something far more sinister, a fever that burned so hot it seemed to consume her from within, accompanied by a weakness that left her barely able to lift her head from the pillow. Dr. Pemberton, the royal physician, had tried everything in his considerable arsenal. Bloodletting, purging, exotic remedies imported from the far reaches of the empire, nothing had worked. Day after day, I watched my mother grow weaker, her once vibrant eyes becoming glassy with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. The court physicians whispered among themselves in the corridors, their faces grave, and I knew without being told that they had given up hope. It was on a particularly stormy night in late October that I made the decision that would change everything. The rain was beating against the windows with unusual fury, and the wind howled through the corridors like a living thing. I had been sitting beside my mother's bed, holding her burning hand and listening to her delirious murmurs, when I realized I could not simply sit there and watch her die. If the finest medical minds in England could not save her, then I would seek help elsewhere, no matter how unconventional. I waited until the early hours of the morning, when the castle was quiet and the guards were at their most complacent, then slipped out through the servants' quarters. I had done this before, of course, sneaking out in disguise to walk among my future subjects and understand their lives, but never with such desperate purpose. I dressed in the rough clothes of a common laborer, pulled a wool cap low over my distinctive dark hair, and set out into the storm-lashed countryside. The village of Millbrook lay 3 miles from the castle, a humble collection of thatched cottages and muddy lanes that I had visited several times in my disguised wanderings. I had heard rumors there of a healer, someone who worked with herbs and old knowledge, someone the villagers whispered about with a mixture of respect and superstition. In my desperation, I was willing to try anything. I found the cottage easily enough. It stood slightly apart from the others, with a small garden that even in the harsh weather showed signs of careful cultivation. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a warm light glowed in the windows. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, uncertain of what reception I might receive. The door opened to reveal an elderly man with kind eyes and hands stained green from his work with plants. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of a young woman with auburn hair, her sleeves rolled up as she worked over a steaming pot. The older man studied me carefully in the dim light, taking in my soaked clothes and desperate expression. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and my accent common. "I need help. My lady is dying, and the physicians say there is nothing to be done. I have heard that you might know of remedies they do not." The old man introduced himself as Master Hartwell, and the young woman stepped forward from the shadows. This was my first clear look at Isabel, and even in that moment of crisis, I was struck by her remarkable presence. She was perhaps 21 years old, with intelligent green eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. Her auburn hair was braided back practically, and her dress was simple but clean. Most remarkably, her hands, delicate but strong, bore the small scars and stains that spoke of constant work with plants and healing compounds. "What are her symptoms?" Isabel asked, her voice clear and direct. There was no deference in her manner, no hesitation. She spoke like someone accustomed to taking charge in medical emergencies, regardless of social niceties. I described my mother's condition in detail, the burning fever, the weakness, the way she seemed to drift in and out of consciousness. Isabel listened intently, occasionally asking precise questions that revealed a depth of medical knowledge that surpassed many trained physicians I had encountered. When I finished speaking, she exchanged a meaningful look with her father. "It sounds like the wasting fever," Master Hartwell said gravely. "It has taken several in the neighboring villages this autumn. The learned doctors from the city have had no success with their treatments." "But you have?" I asked, not bothering to hide the desperate hope in my voice. Isabel nodded slowly. "We have had some success, yes. But the treatment is intensive, and it requires someone to stay with the patient constantly for several days. The remedies must be prepared fresh and administered precisely on schedule, or they lose their effectiveness." I thought of my mother lying in that great bed, surrounded by hovering courtiers and ineffective physicians, and made another decision that would have horrified the court if they had known. "Would you come with me? Tonight? I can pay whatever you ask." What followed was a conversation that revealed much about Isabel's character. She did not ask about payment, did not hesitate because of the storm or the late hour. Instead, she asked practical questions about my mother's current treatments, about the layout of where she was staying, about whether there would be interference from other medical practitioners. When I assured her that I could arrange for privacy and that she would have complete authority over the treatment, she simply nodded and began gathering her supplies. The journey back to the castle was treacherous in the storm, but Isabel showed no fear or complaint. She rode behind me on my horse, her bag of medical supplies clutched tightly against her chest, and when we arrived at the secret entrance I had used, she followed me through the dark corridors without question. I led her to a small chamber adjacent to my mother's rooms, a space usually reserved for ladies-in-waiting but which I had cleared for this purpose. When Isabel first saw my mother, I watched her face carefully for any sign of recognition or shock at finding herself treating royalty. But her expression showed only professional concern as she approached the bed and began her examination. She felt my mother's pulse, looked at her eyes and tongue, asked me detailed questions about when the fever had started and how it had progressed. "She is very ill," Isabel said quietly, "but I have seen this before, and with proper treatment, there is hope." She began unpacking her supplies, dried herbs I could not identify, small bottles containing mysterious preparations, tools for grinding and mixing that looked ancient but well maintained. What happened over the next 3 days was nothing short of miraculous. Isabel worked with a dedication that put the court physicians to shame, preparing fresh remedies every few hours, monitoring my mother's condition constantly, adjusting her treatments based on the slightest changes in symptoms. She slept in brief snatches on a chair beside the bed, ate little, and never once complained about the difficulty or irregularity of her situation. I stayed as much as I could, both to help and to ensure that no one discovered what was happening. It was during those long vigils that I truly came to understand Isabel's remarkable character. She was not simply knowledgeable about herbs and healing, she understood the human body in ways that surpassed formal medical training. More than that, she possessed a natural compassion that made her gentle with my mother even in her delirium, speaking softly to her, adjusting her position for comfort, treating her with the same care she might show her own family. On the third morning, my mother's fever finally broke. I was dozing in a chair when Isabel touched my shoulder gently. "Your Majesty," she whispered, and I realized she had known all along who my mother was, though she had never said a word about it. "She is asking for water." I looked toward the bed and saw my mother's eyes, clear and alert for the first time in weeks, looking back at me. The improvement was so dramatic, so complete, that I could hardly believe it. Within hours, she was sitting up and taking proper food. Within a day, she was well enough to receive visitors, though we agreed that Isabel's role in her recovery would remain our secret. The weeks following my coronation passed in a blur of state business, diplomatic meetings, and the endless ceremonial duties that come with wearing the crown. Yet beneath the surface of royal protocol, I found myself consumed by thoughts of Isabel. I had learned from discreet inquiries that she had been employed in the castle for nearly 6 months, working in the kitchens and helping with general cleaning duties. No one seemed to know much about her background, which was not unusual for servants, but it meant that her remarkable medical knowledge remained hidden beneath the humble exterior of a castle maid. I began to orchestrate encounters with her, disguising my interest as routine royal inspections of the castle's various departments. These visits, I told my advisors, were necessary to ensure that the household was running efficiently under the new reign. In truth, they were carefully planned opportunities to observe Isabel and, when possible, to speak with her directly. The first such encounter came 3 weeks after my coronation. I was conducting what I claimed was a surprise inspection of the kitchens when I found her there, her sleeves rolled up as she helped prepare vegetables for the evening meal. She looked up when I entered with my small retinue, and I saw recognition flicker in her green eyes before she quickly dropped into a proper curtsy along with the other servants. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, her voice steady despite what must have been considerable surprise at seeing me there. I made a show of examining the kitchen operations, asking questions about food preparation and storage, but my attention was entirely focused on her. She moved with quiet efficiency, never drawing attention to herself but somehow managing to be exactly where she was needed most. When one of the other servants accidentally knocked over a pot of hot soup and scalded her hand, Isabel was immediately there with a cold cloth and soothing words, tending to the injury with the same gentle competence I remembered from my mother's sickroom. "You seem to have some knowledge of treating injuries," I observed, moving closer to where she was bandaging the other woman's hand. Isabel looked up at me, and for a moment I saw uncertainty in her expression. "I have some experience with healing, Your Majesty. My father taught me about herbs and their uses." "Indeed? And where did your father acquire such knowledge?" "He was apprenticed to the village healer in Millbrook, Your Majesty, before he became a clerk. He believed that all knowledge was valuable, regardless of one's station in life." The way she spoke those last words, with just the slightest emphasis, told me that she understood the deeper meaning of our conversation. She was acknowledging our shared secret without saying anything that could be overheard and misinterpreted by the others present. Over the following weeks, I found excuses to visit different parts of the castle where I might encounter her. I discovered that she could read and write, unusual skills for someone of her apparent station, and that she possessed a quick intelligence that made our brief conversations far more engaging than most of the formal discussions I endured with my advisors. She spoke thoughtfully about everything from the proper care of plants in the castle gardens to observations about the health and welfare of the other servants. It was during one of these encounters that I realized my feelings toward her had evolved far beyond gratitude. I had come to the castle laundry to inspect the facilities, another of my supposed efficiency reviews, when I found her there helping to wash and mend the household linens. She was working over a large tub of hot water, her auburn hair escaping from its cap in the humid warmth, her face flushed from the steam. When she looked up and saw me watching her, she smiled slightly, and the effect was like a physical blow to my chest. "Your Majesty," she said, setting down her work and curtsying. "I hope everything meets with your approval." "Everything appears to be in excellent order," I replied, my voice sounding strangely formal to my own ears. "Tell me, do you find the work here satisfactory? Are you treated well by the other staff?" "Very well, Your Majesty. Everyone has been most kind." She paused, then added with a meaningful look, "I am grateful for the opportunity to serve in whatever capacity I can." There it was again, that careful choice of words that acknowledged our shared history without revealing anything to casual listeners. But there was something else in her expression, a warmth that suggested her feelings toward me might not be entirely limited to gratitude and respect. That night, lying in the great royal bed that felt more like a prison than a comfort, I allowed myself to truly examine what was happening to me. I was falling in love with Isabel Hartwell, a castle servant who had once saved my mother's life. The very thought was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. I was the King of England, expected to marry for political advantage, to strengthen alliances and secure the succession. The court was already beginning to pressure me about suitable matches among the daughters of European nobility. But when I closed my eyes, I did not see the faces of foreign princesses or English duchesses. I saw gentle green eyes and auburn hair, scarred hands that had worked miracles, and a smile that seemed to light up even the dreariest castle corridors. I thought about our conversations, brief as they were, and how much more substantial they felt than the elaborate court rituals that filled my days. The problem was not simply one of social class, though that was certainly insurmountable enough. The issue was that I barely knew her, despite the intensity of my feelings. Our interactions had been limited to those brief encounters during my supposed inspections, carefully chaperoned moments where neither of us could speak freely. I knew she was intelligent, compassionate, and possessed remarkable medical knowledge, but I knew little about her thoughts, her dreams, her feelings about anything beyond her immediate duties. I began to plan more elaborate ways to spend time with her, always within the bounds of what could be explained by royal duty. I instituted a program of regular meetings with representatives from different departments of the household, ostensibly to ensure better communication between the crown and those who served it. When it came time to meet with representatives from the domestic staff, I specifically requested that they include someone with knowledge of maintaining the health and welfare of the household workers. Isabel was selected for this role, and suddenly I found myself with legitimate reasons to meet with her privately in my study. These meetings, held weekly under the pretext of discussing castle management, became the highlight of my existence. We would sit across from each other at the great oak table where I conducted state business, and for an hour each week, I could simply talk with her as one human being to another. It was during these conversations that I truly came to know Isabel's remarkable mind. She spoke intelligently about everything from improving sanitation in the servants' quarters to organizing better medical care for the household staff. She had ideas about education, about treating people with dignity regardless of their social position, about the responsibility that those in power had to care for those who served them. I believe, she said during one of our meetings, her eyes bright with conviction, that every person has value, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. A king who truly understands his people must know not just the lords and ladies of his court, but also the servants who make their comfortable lives possible. And how would you suggest a king gain such understanding? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. By listening, she replied simply. By spending time among all his subjects, not just those who are powerful enough to demand his attention. By remembering that the strength of a kingdom comes not just from its armies and its wealth, but from the health and happiness of all its people. As she spoke, her hands moved expressively, and I found myself studying the small scars that marked her fingers and palms. Each mark told a story of service, of reaching into thorny bushes to gather healing herbs, of working with hot preparations and sharp tools in service of others' welfare. They were beautiful hands, I thought, far more beautiful than the soft, unmarked hands of the court ladies who had never done anything more challenging than embroidery. It was also during these meetings that I began to suspect Isabel's feelings toward me might be evolving as well. She was always properly respectful, always maintained the appropriate forms of address and deportment, but there were moments when our eyes would meet across the table and I would see something that went far beyond duty or gratitude. There was warmth there, and interest, and perhaps even the beginning of the same impossible longing that was consuming me. The realization that she might return my feelings only made my situation more complicated. If I had been dealing simply with my own impossible attraction to someone beneath my station, I might have found a way to manage it, to fulfill my royal duties while keeping my personal feelings private. But if she cared for me as well, then I was not the only one who would be hurt by the inevitable necessity of my marrying someone else. The court, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly insistent about the question of my marriage. Lord Chancellor Ashford had begun presenting me with detailed reports about eligible princesses and duchesses, complete with portraits and assessments of the political advantages each alliance would bring. The pressure was subtle but constant, a reminder that my personal feelings were considered irrelevant compared to the needs of the state. It was in the depths of February, when the winter cold seemed to seep into the very stones of the castle and the morning frost painted intricate patterns on the windows, that crisis struck our kingdom. Reports began arriving from the outlying villages of a new sickness, something more virulent and deadly than the usual winter ailments. The symptoms were terrifying in their severity: high fever, difficulty breathing, and a weakness so profound that many victims simply wasted away within days of falling ill. Dr. Pemberton and his colleagues were summoned immediately to provide counsel, but their response was dismally familiar. They spoke of balancing humors, of bloodletting and purging, of expensive remedies that had shown little success against similar ailments in the past. As the reports continued to arrive, each more dire than the last, I found myself thinking inevitably of Isabel and her remarkable healing abilities. The tipping point came when word arrived that the sickness had reached the village of Millbrook, the very place where I had first sought Isabel's help 3 years earlier. Entire families were falling ill, and the local physician had already fled in fear for his own safety. The death toll was mounting rapidly, and panic was beginning to spread throughout the surrounding areas. I was in council with my advisors when the most devastating news arrived. A messenger, pale and trembling with exhaustion, brought word that the sickness had now appeared in the castle itself. 3 servants in the eastern wing had fallen ill with symptoms that matched perfectly those described in the village reports. The fear in the room was palpable as my advisors immediately began discussing quarantine measures and evacuation plans for the royal family. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Ashford said, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine alarm, "we must consider removing you to Windsor Castle immediately. This pestilence cannot be allowed to threaten the crown." But I was not thinking about my own safety. I was thinking about the servants who were already sick, about the villages where people were dying without hope of effective treatment, and about the one person in my kingdom who had already proven she could succeed where conventional medicine failed. That evening, I sent word requesting an immediate private meeting with Isabel. She arrived at my study promptly, her expression concerned but composed. When I told her about the spreading sickness and the failure of the court physicians to provide effective treatment, I saw her face grow grave with understanding. "I have heard whispers among the servants about the illness in the villages," she said quietly. "And I know about the cases that have appeared here in the castle. The symptoms you describe are indeed similar to conditions I have encountered before, though this seems more severe. Do you believe you could help?" I asked directly, abandoning the careful protocols that usually governed our conversations. "Not just individual cases, but could you develop treatments that might be used more widely?" Isabel was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working through the implications of what I was asking. "I believe I could help, yes. But Your Majesty, if I were to attempt such a thing openly, there would be consequences. The court physicians would not welcome interference from someone of my station, especially someone without formal medical training. There are those who might even suggest that my methods are somehow unnatural or inappropriate." She was referring, I knew, to the persistent suspicion that often surrounded healers who worked with herbs and folk remedies. In times of crisis, fear could quickly turn to accusations of witchcraft or other supernatural explanations for medical knowledge that seemed to surpass conventional understanding. "And if I were to support your efforts publicly?" I asked. "If I were to give you official authority to treat the sick, would that protect you from such accusations?" "It might," she replied carefully, "but it would also require you to explain how you know about my abilities. Our previous collaboration was kept secret for good reasons, Your Majesty. Revealing it now might raise questions that could be uncomfortable for the crown." We looked at each other across the desk, and I knew we were both thinking about far more than medical treatments and political consequences. If I supported Isabel publicly, if I gave her the authority and resources she needed to fight this plague, I would be revealing to the entire court that I had been meeting regularly with a castle servant. I would be placing my trust and the kingdom's welfare in the hands of someone my advisors would consider completely inappropriate for such responsibility. More than that, I would be making a choice that went far beyond the immediate medical crisis. I would be choosing to value Isabel's abilities and judgment over the established medical hierarchy, choosing to trust someone whose primary qualifications were her intelligence, compassion, and proven results rather than her formal credentials or social position. "There is something else you should know," Isabel said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If I am to attempt this, if I am to try to develop treatments that could help many people, I will need to work openly with the sick. I will need to examine patients, prepare remedies in quantities much larger than I have ever attempted before, and coordinate with others who can help distribute treatments to the affected villages. I cannot do this in secret." The weight of her words settled between us like a physical presence. She was asking me to make a choice that would change everything, not just for the immediate crisis, but for both of our futures. If I supported her publicly, if I gave her the authority she needed, there would be no going back to our careful, chaperoned meetings and disguised conversations. "What would you need?" I asked, my heart pounding as I made the decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "Access to the castle's herb gardens and medicinal supplies, permission to set up a proper preparation area where I can work without interference, and authority to examine and treat patients regardless of their station. I would also need assistance, people who can help gather materials, prepare remedies, and carry treatments to the affected areas." I found myself nodding before she had finished speaking. "You shall have all of that and more." "What else?" "Protection," she said simply. "Not just for myself, but for those who work with me. If these treatments succeed, we will be celebrated. But if they fail, if people continue to die despite our efforts, there will be those who look for someone to blame. Folk healers and women who work with herbs are often the first to be accused when conventional solutions have failed." The truth of her words hit me like a cold wind. By supporting her publicly, I would not only be risking my own reputation and political standing, but I would be placing her in a position where failure could have consequences far more serious than professional embarrassment. You would have my complete protection, I said firmly. Anyone who questioned your methods or your authority would be questioning me directly. Isabel studied my face carefully, and I could see her weighing not just the medical and political implications of what we were discussing, but the personal ones as well. She understood, as I did, that this decision would fundamentally change the nature of our relationship. There would be no more pretending that I was simply a king conducting routine inspections and she was simply a servant providing information. We would be partners in this endeavor, working together openly for the first time since the desperate night 3 years ago when she had saved my mother's life. Very well, she said finally. But I have one condition, Your Majesty. If I do this, if I accept this responsibility, I must be allowed to work according to my own judgment and methods. I cannot have court physicians interfering with my treatments or second-guessing my decisions based on their conventional training. Either you trust me completely, or we should not attempt this at all. The boldness of her demand should have shocked me, but instead I found it reassuring. This was the same confidence and directness that had impressed me during my mother's illness, the same willingness to take responsibility and make difficult decisions that had saved the Queen's life when others had given up. You shall have complete authority over the medical response to this crisis, I declared. As of tomorrow, you will be appointed as royal healer, with full access to all resources you require and complete autonomy in your treatment decisions. The silence that followed was charged with implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. We both understood that I had just made a decision that would shock the court, challenge every convention of royal protocol, and place both of our reputations at considerable risk. But we also understood that it was the right decision, both for the kingdom and for us personally. The announcement of Isabel's appointment as royal healer sent shockwaves through the court that I could feel reverberating through every stone corridor of the castle. Lord Chancellor Ashford requested an immediate private audience, his face a mask of barely controlled displeasure when he entered my study that morning. Your Majesty, he began, his voice tight with diplomatic restraint, I must express my grave concerns about this unprecedented appointment. The court physicians are questioning the wisdom of placing such responsibility in the hands of someone with no formal medical training, no university education, and no standing within the established medical hierarchy. I looked at him steadily, my decision already made and my resolve strengthened by a night of reflection. Lord Chancellor, the established medical hierarchy has proven itself incapable of addressing this crisis. Dar. Pemberton and his colleagues have offered nothing but the same failed treatments that have been used for generations. Meanwhile, people are dying in increasing numbers throughout my kingdom. But Your Majesty, to elevate a servant, a woman of unknown background, to such a position. A woman, I interrupted, who has already proven her abilities under the most challenging circumstances. A woman whose knowledge and methods have succeeded where conventional medicine has failed. Ashford's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see him calculating, trying to understand how I could know so much about Isabel's medical abilities. Your Majesty, forgive me, but how can you be certain of her capabilities? What evidence do you have that she can succeed where trained physicians cannot? This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. To fully support Isabel, to give her the authority and protection she needed, I would have to reveal at least part of our shared history. 3 years ago, I said carefully, when my mother was dying of a similar fever, this woman was consulted privately. Her treatment succeeded completely when the court physicians had given up hope. The silence that followed was profound. Ashford stared at me as the implications of my words sank in, and I could see his mind racing through the political ramifications of what I had just revealed. Your Majesty, he said slowly, are you saying that you consulted with a folk healer regarding the Queen's illness? That you brought an untrained village woman into the royal chambers? I am saying that I sought help wherever it might be found to save my mother's life, and that help proved effective. My voice carried a warning that I hoped he would heed. I am also saying that I will not allow political considerations or social prejudices to prevent me from using every available resource to protect my subjects. Over the following days, Isabel worked with an intensity and dedication that put every criticism of her appointment to shame. She established her preparation area in a large chamber near the castle kitchens, transforming it into something that resembled both laboratory and apothecary. I visited frequently, ostensibly to monitor the progress of our response to the crisis, but in truth because I was fascinated by watching her work. She moved with complete confidence, mixing preparations, training assistants, and coordinating the distribution of treatments to affected areas. Her knowledge seemed to encompass not just the properties of individual herbs, but complex interactions between different remedies and the ways that treatments needed to be modified based on patient age, constitution, and the progression of their illness. More remarkable still was her ability to organize and lead others. Within days, she had assembled a team of assistants from among the castle servants, training them to recognize symptoms, prepare basic remedies, and provide supportive care. She spoke to each person with respect and clarity, never condescending despite her obvious superior knowledge, always taking time to explain not just what needed to be done but why. The results, when they began to appear, were nothing short of miraculous. The 3 servants who had fallen ill in the castle were among the first to receive Isabel's treatments, and within a week they had made complete recoveries. Reports from the villages told a similar story, death rates dropping dramatically wherever her remedies were being used, families reunited as loved ones recovered from illnesses that had seemed hopeless. But it was during the 3rd week of her work that the most significant development occurred. Word arrived that the sickness had appeared in the household of the Duke of Somerset, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom and a man whose support was crucial to my reign. The Duke's own son, heir to one of England's greatest estates, lay dying despite the attention of the finest physicians money could procure. Somerset himself arrived at court to request Isabel's assistance, his pride clearly warring with his desperation as he made the unprecedented request for help from someone he would normally consider far beneath his notice. I watched Isabel's face as she listened to his description of his son's condition, saw the familiar look of professional concentration that had become so dear to me. "I will come immediately," she said simply, already beginning to gather the supplies she would need. "But I must warn your grace that my methods may seem unusual, and I will require complete authority over the treatment without interference from other medical practitioners." Somerset agreed without hesitation, and I insisted on accompanying them to his estate. The journey took most of a day, riding through countryside where signs of the plague's devastation were visible in abandoned cottages and hastily dug graves. But there were also signs of recovery in areas where Isabel's treatments had been distributed, villages showing renewed activity, people working in fields and markets that had been deserted just weeks earlier. At Somerset's estate, Isabel's treatment of his son became a demonstration that silenced every remaining critic. Working with the same focused intensity one remembered from my mother's illness, she quickly diagnosed complications that the attending physicians had missed and implemented a treatment plan that seemed to take effect almost immediately. Within 2 days, the young man was sitting up and taking food. Within a week, he was walking in his father's gardens. The Duke's gratitude was profound and public. Upon our return to court, he made a formal declaration before the assembled nobility, acknowledging that Isabel's intervention had saved his son's life and calling her a healer of unprecedented skill whose methods surpass anything in conventional medical practice. It was after this triumph that I finally found the courage to address the question that had been burning in my heart throughout this entire crisis. I had asked Isabel to meet with me privately in my study, ostensibly to discuss the ongoing coordination of medical efforts throughout the kingdom. But when she arrived, I found myself unable to maintain the pretense of purely professional interest. "Isabel," I said, using her name without formal address for the first time since our renewed acquaintance, "I need to speak with you about something beyond medical matters." She looked at me with those remarkable green eyes, and I saw in them an understanding that told me she had been anticipating this conversation as much as I had been dreading and longing for it. "I know that my position makes this inappropriate, perhaps even impossible," I continued, "but I must tell you that my feelings toward you have grown far beyond gratitude or professional respect. I have come to love you, Isabel, and I believe, I hope, that your feelings toward me may have developed similarly." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly, though it could have been only moments. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I have loved you since that first night when you came to my father's cottage, desperate to save your mother," she said. "Not because you were a prince, but because of the kind of man who would risk everything for someone he loved. These past months, watching you choose to support what was right over what was conventional, seeing you place the welfare of your people above political considerations, it has only deepened those feelings. What happened next changed both of our lives forever." I crossed the room to where she stood, took her scarred hands in mine, and asked her to be my wife. Not my mistress, not a secret love hidden away from court scrutiny, but my queen, my partner in ruling a kingdom that desperately needed the kind of wisdom and compassion she possessed. Her acceptance came with tears of joy and protestations that she was not worthy of such an honor, protestations that I silenced with assurances that it was I who was unworthy of her remarkable spirit and abilities. Our wedding took place 2 months later, in the spring when the castle gardens were blooming with the same herbs Isabel had used to heal our kingdom. The ceremony was attended by nobles and commoners alike, including many of those whose lives she had saved during the plague. The Duke of Somerset himself served as one of our witnesses, declaring publicly that he could think of no better choice for England's queen than a woman who had proven herself capable of such remarkable service. As I stood beside Isabel at the altar, listening to her promise to love and honor me as I promised the same to her, I reflected on how completely my understanding of nobility and worth had been transformed. True nobility, I had learned, came not from bloodlines or titles, but from character, compassion, and the courage to serve others regardless of personal cost. Our kingdom flourished under Isabel's influence as royal healer and later as queen. Her medical knowledge saved countless lives, but more importantly, her example helped establish new principles of service and care that elevated the lives of all our subjects. She instituted programs for training healers, established hospitals for the poor, and created a system of medical care that served people based on their need rather than their ability to pay. And I learned that love, when founded on mutual respect and shared values, could indeed transform not just individual lives but entire kingdoms. In choosing love over convention, in trusting my heart over political calculation, I had found not just personal happiness but a partnership that made me a better king and a better man. The scars on Isabel's hands, those marks of her service to others, became symbols to me of everything I valued most: dedication, sacrifice, and the kind of love that expresses itself through action rather than words. Every day I was reminded that the woman who shared my throne had earned her position not through accident of birth, but through a lifetime of choosing to help others, even when it required great personal risk. If you are watching this story from anywhere in the world, I hope it reminds you that true worth comes from who we choose to be, not from the circumstances of our birth. And if this tale of love conquering social barriers has touched your heart, please subscribe to hear more stories of courage, love, and the triumph of the human spirit over seemingly impossible obstacles. Love always finds a way, when we have the courage to choose it over fear.